On stardate 43997, Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise was kidnapped for 6 days by an invading force known as the Borg. Surgically altered, he was forced to lead an assault on Starfleet at Wolf 359. So, this is a slightly unusual video for me. Normally when I look at Eaglemoss models, I look at individual models and I look at the magazines and I take you through them and, give you a bit of a sort of show and tell kind of thing. But I wanted to take a slightly different approach here, because this chap is a cube. It's a Borg cube, and this caused the heroes of Star Trek The Next Generation no end of problems when it was first brought on screen, and it was then responsible for an incredibly vicious defeat of Starfleet, which is the Federation's fleet of ships, at a star system called Wolf 359. Wolf 359 is a real star, so that's it's scientifically accurate to have to put the battle there, in the sense that it exists and it's not just sort of a random made-up star. And if you haven't already seen The Best of Both Worlds, which is the end of Season 3, start of Season 4 of Star Trek Next Generation, it's a two-parter, classic cliffhanger stuff, and it's well worth watching because it's one of those really sort of critical episodes of Next Gen, which leads into films and indeed Star Trek Picard itself as the most recent series. So it's a really, really interesting one to watch, and I have rewatched it before making this video. And what I want to focus on here is a number of things. It's just to sort of talk around the episodes a little bit, but also to have a look at what the model makers, and this is an important point, the actual model makers, so no CGI here. These are all physical models that we're talking about. They had to create a brand new fleet of ships that were all distressed to varying degrees. And I cannot believe the extent of that ask and how many hours they must have put in to try and make this a reality. So, if you're watching this video, you're probably already familiar with this, but this cube was being led by Captain Jean-Luc Picard, who had been changed into a Borg and made into a locutus of Borg. And I'm going to look at some figures of him in another video, but it was one of those really sort of seminal moments in Star Trek Next Gen where it completely upended everything we thought we knew, in the sense that all of a sudden Picard was the big bad. He was going to take on Starfleet and they were potentially going to assimilate the Earth, and it had been well established that the Borg could adapt to pretty much anything that Starfleet could throw at it, short of being completely destroyed by them. So nothing they tried to do to stop this Borg cube worked, and then they thought it would be a good idea to throw 39 starships at it, and they all, I think, but possibly bar one, and I'm not quite sure which one it was, but basically complete and utter defeat. And we see this battle in two ways. We see it in Aftermath in Best of Both Worlds Part 2, but then we also see it as it was taking place in the opening episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And one of the ships I will talk about is the USS Saratoga. The USS Saratoga, which was the ship that Benjamin Sisko is in charge of. But if we set aside this Borg cube now, I want to talk to you about some of these extra ships, because what they did frequently in Star Trek was they reused ships to represent other ships, because the Federation basically tended to reuse the same designs over and over again, but obviously kind of as different ship names. So if we take this ship as an example, so this is the USS Excelsior. I need to put my teeth in today. NCC 2000. So this Excelsior model was used in Star Trek 3. I can't remember if we technically saw it a little bit before that, but it features quite prominently in Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. But the Excelsior class of ship is then seen a lot in Star Trek Next Gen, and it's generally depicted as a sort of transport type ship. You know, it's doing sort of it's used to ferry high-ranking admirals around the place quite a lot, and indeed we see it in Best of Both Worlds doing just that. So it's a ship that we see a lot of. So the studio had at its disposal lots of ships like this, where they could just redo the registry on the front and turn it into another ship. They might even be able to sort of disassemble it, mangle it, even reuse its mold to actually create new ships on screen. Because again, as I said earlier, they did not have CGI, so everything they did had to be physical. They had to make it. Now, what this means is that they had to have the Enterprise D flying through a graveyard of ships in Best of Both Worlds. We never see on screen in Best of Both Worlds what the ships looked like before they got banged up. But let me show you just how sort of clever they had to be with these. So here we have the USS Kyushu, and this, I believe, is a New Orleans class ship. Now, the Kyushu is, I wouldn't say it's unusual, because it does happen with other ships, but I just showed you an Excelsior class ship, and that Excelsior class ship was actually, one of the Excelsior class ships in the battle was called the USS Melbourne, and that gets name checked by Shelby as one of the ships that's definitely been destroyed. The Kyushu here is also name checked as one of the ships that was destroyed. But this is a class of ship we'd never seen before. And it's one of these ships where you see it in the graveyard in space as they're flying through, and it's kind of very, very indistinct. I mean, I have real problems trying to resolve the look of a lot of these ships. But I did watch it last night, and once you know what you're looking for, it is kind of possible to start seeing the remains of some of these ships around and about the place in space, where they've been clobbered. So that's certainly possible, but you do need a really eagle eye and a really good, and the sort of the Blu-ray-esque kind of version of Next Gen. So this ship is a kit bash, basically. It's a very coherent kit bash, but it is nonetheless a kit bash. And what do I mean by that? Well, you may well be familiar with the term anyway, but you see these two pods on the top here? They're highlighter pens. Oh yes. These warp nacelles are Enterprise D Galaxy class warp nacelles, but get this, they didn't make them from scratch. These were almost certainly bought in from commercially available models of the Enterprise D. So they went to the shop, got an Ertl AMT model kit, brought it into the studio and borrowed its nacelles, basically. Now, a lot of these models are actually quite big, so they had to make them at a certain scale for filming purposes, of course, so that's kind of understandable, but nonetheless, you can see that they are borrowing elements. This is probably, although it's kind of scaled down a bit, I think it looks like a Galaxy class saucer section. So they are basically sort of reusing as much stuff as they can find. You can see that again. If you in fact, I mean, it's quite interesting. If you look at this ship this way round, it looks like a sort of it's got Ambassador class pylons, and Galaxy class nacelles, and a sort of a navigational deflector, which is, I think, again Galaxy class. So its engineering hull is Galaxy class, but again they've stuck another highlighter pen on the bottom of it. So it's a very, very sort of clever thing to do, because they are reusing as much as they possibly can to give themselves a fighting chance of actually coming up with this huge number of ships that they need in distressed forms to actually make the episode work. And I don't know exactly how much notice they had of this. But it's been very interesting reading some of the supporting magazines. Now, I don't have all the magazines for all of these ships, but let me show you a couple of others which are quite entertaining, because once you see these things, you can't really unsee them. So here we have the USS Chekhov, NCC 57302. And bear in mind as well, the other really interesting thing about Eaglemoss is you will probably never ever see intact models of these ships anywhere other than Eaglemoss, because they never actually appeared on screen as being intact. They actually got reused to reappear in a junkyard scene in another episode much later on, after the Battle of Wolf 359. But what do you notice about these two ships? If I sort of line them up next to each other, now you can see that the saucer sections are actually slightly different to one another. But these warp nacelles, again, we've never seen these warp nacelles before. This style of warp nacelle was completely new for the Wolf 359 battle and Best of Both Worlds episode. And these again, they're highlighter pens. Brilliantly clever. Very, very smart move. We need to make these ships quickly. What can we do? We'll just grab everyday objects and turn them into starship nacelles. Also interesting thing about these ships is the USS Chekhov looks pretty standard. It's got this wacky sort of sensory kind of thing going on in the back, but it's only got 2 nacelles. Now, the Awane here, now I think this is, I'm going to say it's Cheyenne class, but I could be wrong. Nope, I'm right, it's Cheyenne class. So I have been doing my homework, honest. But this has got 4 nacelles. Now, there is a precedent for this, because Picard's prior command that he was in command of for some time with the USS Stargazer, that had 4 nacelles. And you will see that Constellation class ship in my sort of overall lineup of ships from Wolf 359. But this is, it's relatively unusual to see a 4 nacelled ship. Generally speaking, Roddenberry sort of preferred pairs of nacelles. So the Federation ships tend to have 2, but they always have to have even numbers, typically. I'll come to that. But here we have one that's got 4, so we have 2 pairs, which allows for some redundancy. It allows for what's called warp coasting, I've understood now. Apparently, nacelles are sometimes described as creating power, or giving ships more power. It might enable you to have a higher warp speed overall, but as I understand it, your warp core would have to be powering 4 nacelles. So it doesn't give you more power, it requires more power to actually make you go, because you've got 4 nacelles to power. That's my understanding, but please let me know in the comments if I'm misunderstanding that. But I just don't understand how nacelles are supposed to actually contribute to the power of the ship in terms of its overall sort of energy, generation abilities. That I don't get. So anyway, unfortunately I don't have the magazines for these. I picked these up as part of a job lot a while ago, and that was what set my mind thinking to actually, could I actually pull together all the ship classes from Wolf 359 and actually sort of, do a sort of show and tell, which is what I'm doing here, of course. So these guys are in a class all by themselves, because these warp nacelles I don't think we've ever seen before or since. So they are they're probably kind of quite, the ships with 4 nacelles tend to be sort of deep space exploration types, because it gives them some redundancy. If one of the nacelles gets damaged, they've still got 3 or still got 2 that they can use to form a balanced warp field and get themselves out of bother. I'm not sure what level of ship the Chekhov was. It could have been a sort of a light cruisery sort of ship. It's got a funny underslung. Is this another highlighter? Yeah, it's oops, nearly. This could well be another. That's another sort of highlight. Oops, another highlighter pen it's got on its on the underside here. So, actually no, sorry, no, it's not. Actually, when I look at it now, it's actually really interesting. Chekhov's really interesting. I wish I did have the magazine now. It's got a really sort of unusual underslung kind of navigational deflector secondary hull, but it's on struts. It's almost It's almost Oberth-esque. I'm gonna have to get the magazine for this and do this one separately, because this one looks really, really interesting. I don't know what they had in mind there in terms of class of ship, but that's fascinating. I've never seen a Federation ship that is quite so sort of complex in terms of its layout. That's really bizarre. That's a fun ship, though. Definitely a fun ship, and of course, yes, it is a tribute to the character you think it is a tribute to as well. Of course, Pavel Chekhov from the original series. So we have there. So we had the Kyushu, which was a sort of a blend of the kit bashing that was going on for those two there, and the Galaxy class as well. And apparently, the New Orleans has got a bit of a sort of a fan base now. But let me show you 3 others, which I do have the magazines for. In fact, I'll show you 4 that I have the magazines for, in a little bit of detail. But we have here the Niagara class. Now, this is a funny old one, and I'm gonna pop this up a little bit so you can see the magazine more clearly. But this is a funny old one. So this has not 1, not 2, but 3 warp nacelles. And so far as Federation starship designs are concerned, that's a complete no. You just don't have a 3 nacelled ship like ever. Very, very odd. Very, very odd indeed. But again, they were trying to, create these ships or their remains very, very rapidly. So what we have here is this, which is a very, very sort of curious thing indeed to look at. So it's got 1 nacelle underneath the secondary hull and 2 nacelles above. So if you lost this nacelle, it would just look like a pretty standard ship. And its saucer section is quite unique, except for the fact that it's shared by another ship from the graveyards, from the sort of the battle scenes. But this has actually got an Ambassador class secondary hull. And the Ambassador class does turn up in the battle, and it does appear in DS9 Emissary. I'm not sure off the top of my head what the name of it was, but I can quickly run through those as well. And this is just a really sort of curious little ship. So it would have been very, very it was very, very quick, maximum speed warp 9.6, and it's just sort of crazy to think that they would actually go with 3 nacelles, because we just don't see that. The only other time we see that is actually with the Star Trek, the Enterprise D in All Good Things. So what's I think sometimes referred to as the Galaxy X class, that had 3 nacelles, but of course that was an alternate future. So I'm not really sure how canonical that really is. But as you can see here, it's so now this was. I think this is the Princeton. The model I have is the USS Princeton. And yeah, it's just this strange mashup of Galaxy class and Ambassador class, and then a different hull, a different primary hull compared to sort of any of those. So you can see here, obviously, they're mentioning the sort of the Borg incident there. And it's fascinating, because this sort of ship would have been used for sort of diplomatic missions and sort of basic exploration missions, maybe a little bit of sort of patrolling around the place. But as you can see, there isn't a huge amount of detail there in terms of what it's actually got. They mention it having photon torpedo launchers, but I'm not entirely convinced myself. They don't actually label any of them, so I don't know what was going on. But you can see here that this is the sort of detail the guys had to do. You can see the sort of the scale there of the models they were having to come up with to try and produce battle damaged versions of all these ships for the graveyard scene. So incredible task to have to try and do it. So that was the Niagara class. Then on a similar basis we get the Challenger class. This is the USS Buran, and again this is a really odd looking ship, because again it's another kit bash. It's a Galaxy class nacelle, but a sort of a funny little saucer section. I'm not even sure which saucer section this was. I don't know whether I don't think it was Ambassador class, but it's just kind of odd. And it's got this weird sort of connection sort of straight off the saucer section. And then even more weirdly, the two nacelles are above and below that secondary hull, which is just, again, it's like, that's not a thing. It's not normally a thing with Federation-style starships. So again, they just went sort of beyond the norm for this sort of little ship. And again, this is a sort of an escorty, sort of patrol kind of idea. So it wouldn't, they were literally just throwing everything they had available at the Borg. And it's one of the things I'll talk about towards the end of the video, but it's kind of, it's why did they bother doing that against the Borg? They were one of the most formidable opponents going. They could stand up to a Galaxy-class starship and not break a sweat, and yet they were throwing these little patrol ships against them. It's completely pointless, other than distracting them for about 10 seconds. Now, this magazine is actually very, very handy, because when I flicked through it, I realised that whilst it is giving a little bit of sort of, you know, nominal information, this is a classic sort of, that's the graveyard scene there. I couldn't even tell you which one. So the USS Enterprise 1701D arrived at the aftermath of the Battle of Wolf 359 in time to still see the fire that raged through the USS Buran after it engaged the Borg cube. Its remains could just be seen in the bottom right of the view screen, while other Starfleet ships had already burnt out and hung lifelessly in space. So I think it's supposed to be this one here. But even on a sort of a decent sized flat screen TV, they are tiny. And the thing with these ship types is we didn't know them. We didn't know what they were because we'd never seen them before outside of this wreckage. So although they started as fully fledged starships, as you can see here, you know, we have these models of them. When we actually saw them on screen, we'd never seen them on screen before. So it was like, well, I don't know how I feel about this, because I don't even recognise these as normal Federation ships. But they spawned, you know, a minimum of 6 new ship classes just for Wolf 359, which gave the poor sort of, you know, effects people a hell of a lot of work to do, because they had to make these models and then battle damage them and then display them on screen. You know, it's crazy how much effort they had to go to do this. So it must have been one of the most effects intensive episodes they'd probably ever attempted to that point, all using physical models. Now this section in this magazine, and this is, if you were interested, this is issue 114 of the Starship collection from Eaglemoss, you know, sort of magazines, and this has a very useful Borg timeline. Now you could always find this obviously online. I looked at Extraterrestrial Scientia, the website, to sort of source some of my background information and try and figure out which ship classes are actually needed to form the fleet up. But you know, these magazines are great references as well. So the Borg timeline is very, very complex. It's probably even more complex because this is pre-Star Trek Picard. It's even more complex now. But Star Trek First Contact, the film, was set in 2063. That featured time-travelling Borg. Now, the time-travelling Borg then show up in Star Trek Enterprise, the episode Regeneration, in the year 2153. All of these are occurring before, from our point of view, the Borg were first introduced in Star Trek The Next Generation by courtesy of Q. Star Trek Voyager episode Dark Frontier, again, before this TNG episode Q Who, which was set in 2365. So Voyager was both before and after Wolf 359. It's all very, very, very timey-wimey, confusing stuff. So the best of both worlds happened in 2366. That's when Picard got assimilated. That's when the Borg got to Earth but were stopped at the last minute, but not by virtue of the Enterprise managing to outgun them, but by being outsmarted, basically. That was the only chance they had at that point. Then Star Trek First Contact 2373, Star Trek Voyager episode Endgame 2378. And as we now know, they do sort of, you know, they do continue to be involved, but this is kind of, you know, where we were. So this was a really handy magazine to pick up when I was picking up these sort of Galaxy nacelled new class of ships. Very, very useful to have. But it's such odd looking sort of profile for a Starfleet ship. So there's no, it's got tiny little pylons, but nothing to speak of. And then finally, we have the Freedom class, and this is such a kitbashy looking ship. There is precedent for this, I believe, because I think in the original series there was a class of ship that did have just this single sort of neck / pylon and a single nacelle. But again, they've reused the Galaxy class nacelle, strapped some bits to it, strapped a photon torpedo launcher down there. It's got a little bit of a pew gun, which is deeply unusual as a concept for a Federation ship to actually have a sort of a gun as a sort of a pulse phaser, I think it is. This is classed as a light frigate. So phaser emitters and cannons. That's a phaser cannon there, and photon torpedoes as well. So it would sort of pack a bit of a punch, certainly, but it is clearly a tiny little ship. I don't imagine it's apparently warp 9.2 was its best speed for a little while. But it's you've got to hand it to the creators of this magazine. They've given it quite a lot of detail there, quite a big sort of cross section. And then it just goes on to talk about the fourth season of TNG, which was seasons 3 and 4 of TNG were incredibly strong. Apparently a lot of people consider that Best of Both Worlds was what really sort of established Star Trek Next Generation as its own show and sort of allowed it to depart from the original series. The original series' shadow, if you like. So this is it, teeny tiny little ship. You can see there that its saucer section is very reminiscent of the the Niagara classes saucer section. I think this was the Firebrand. This one, or was that the Firebrand? I think this one was. So again, all these ships completely wiped out by the Borg, despite the fact that they were all sort of shiny and new and just introduced. Whew. So, whilst I'm talking now, I'm going to throw up some images and some sort of rotational shots of various classes of ship that go together to make up the Wolf 359 fleet as a whole. So these were all ships that were their class types were used in the battle. So there were 39 ships total. I don't have 39 models, but I do have models that represent most of the ships that were there. Now, included in that is a Nebula class, but the Nebula class that they used wasn't actually the established Nebula class that we see later in the series. It was kind of almost a kit bash of a Nebula class, because it had 2 extra nacelles, little tiny nacelles that they kind of bolted onto it, but they were then dropped when the Nebula class became more of a thing. So I'm not sure how accurate this is. I'm going to show you some magazines when I finish going through all the various sort of ship classes here on the screen, but with one ship class I'm not sure about is there was actually a Galaxy class ship at Wolf 359. There are various different lists of the ships that appeared. Star Trek Online did its own, and I'm actually going by a slightly older list that people like Andrew Probert were responsible for. They were sort of some of the special effects guys, and they have fed into the list of ships that were present at Wolf 359 over the years. So Admiral Hansen in the first episode, Best of Both Worlds Part 1, he seems to be riding around in an Excelsior class, and he is at the battle, and we lose contact with him, so he's presumed dead, I would imagine, or assimilated, one of the two. So maybe he was in an Excelsior class. I've already showed you an Excelsior briefly here, so I don't need to do that again. But you will see it in the series of rotating videos. But I suspect there would have been a Galaxy class in the mix there if they had one available at all. And I have seen reference to one being available, but I don't think that this list I'm going off actually mentions it. But that obviously for reference is the Galaxy class that we're all very familiar with, which is of course what the Enterprise D was. Oddly, there was also a Constitution class hull. You do see it on screen very briefly, but you see this secondary hull is quite distinctive, and apparently the the battle-damaged Star Trek 3 version, the self-destruct version of the Enterprise, they threw it in there because they had it to hand. So I believe that does show up as a Constitution class that was somehow unmothballed and thrown into battle with Borg. Again, I'll come back to this as a concept. There are at least a couple of... I think the Reliant itself, but not the original one here, was involved in the battle. And we also had the Saratoga, of course, which was Sisko's... Well, not Sisko's actual ship. He wasn't captaining at the time, but it was the ship he was on, Wolf 359. There was no Birth class. Now, the Birth class was seen on screen, so that is canonical, getting clobbered through a window of the Saratoga when Ben is trying to rescue his wife. So there was definitely a no Birth in the mix, poor little low Birth. Now, of course, we've already seen the Borg Cube, so we know that was around. The Ambassador class was also around. And it's a shame, we see so little of it, but again, before I forget, this was also in Deep Space Nine Emissary. The Ambassador, an Ambassador class vessel comes in trying to free the Saratoga from the Borg tractor beam and it's caught in. So it's actually on screen as an Ambassador, and one of the relatively few times outside of yesterday's Enterprise we actually see an Ambassador class ship on screen. So it's definitely in the mix. I've already talked about the Excelsior being in the mix. Nebula class, albeit an early version of it, also in the mix. And Stargazer, Constellation class, again, also in the mix. The Stargazer was involved in various interesting confrontations over its time with Picard, either as its sort of second in command or ultimately its captain, including a very big bust up with the Ferengi, which actually more or less resulted in the ship being scuttled. But it did mean that it had to be abandoned with all hands, and shuttlecraft kind of limped away from it. So, again, interesting ship and a 4 nacelle design, which is unusual in the Federation. So, those were all pre-existing ship designs that they reused when they were pulling the episode together. So that meant they had something to work with. They didn't have to start from scratch with these, and they could just sort of reuse their models and just, sort of rough them up a bit and put them in. Or these are ones where we just have them sort of referenced as being at the battle. So great advantages for them in reusing ships that they already had available, because obviously that saved a lot of time. But if they could source parts from existing commercial kits, even better, because then they didn't have to worry about duffing up a studio model, which is always a concern for them, as I understand it, because the studio models are far more expensive to pull together because they have to be that much bigger. So, nice wodge of magazines there, sort of delving into the various ship types that were there. The only ones that I don't have, unfortunately, are the ones for those sort of the Chekhovs and so on of this world that had them highlighter marker pens as nacelles. I don't have those magazines to hand, unfortunately, which is unusual, but it is what it is. So let's talk a little bit about the Saratoga. So this is a Miranda class ship, 243 meters, warp 9.2. Now that seems to my mind, that's pretty fast for an old school Miranda class, but anyway, it is the same class as the Reliant from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but obviously, upgraded modified over time to try and keep it current. And you'll notice it doesn't have the roll bar. So this is actually the first time we've seen this variant of a Miranda without the roll bar, I think. And the Reliant model got reused for things like the USS Bozeman later in the series as well. So we see the Miranda class around a lot still, along with the Excelsior. And for a long time, don't forget, these were the only Starfleet class types of ship that we'd seen. So the idea in Wolf that all of a sudden we had these multiple new classes being brought in, albeit in bits, was actually relatively unusual. I mean, it makes perfect sense because Starfleet would need patrol ships and standard couriers. And in fact, if you think about the concept behind Star Trek Lower Decks, the lower decks ship is exactly that sort of ship. It's the kind of everyday runabouty sort of second contact ship that Starfleet would need, but which obviously isn't normally the hero ship, so we don't normally see it. And the poor old Saratoga, we only see on screen very, very briefly because she does get totaled by the Borg. However, we do see inside her, we see her bridge, we have her shuttle bays established and her sort of life pod points established. These things on the side of her here, I really, really, really wanted them to be laser cannons, phaser cannons, and they're not. They're sensor pods. So that's sad. But these are the things that distinguish her from other Miranda classes. So you can very, very readily identify this as the Saratoga because she's different to every other Miranda class ship going. But you can see that she has the sort of the classic old school nacelles there from the sort of the motion picture-y sort of era of the refit Enterprise, but she is still nevertheless very much got sort of a lot of the elements of the Reliant. So interesting variation on a theme there, but again, because of their constraints, well, I suppose less so in Deep Space Nine, they had fewer constraints. I'd be interested to understand whether or not Deep Space Nine was using CGI right from the get-go, because so we see the Melbourne getting taken out. I think it was the Melbourne right at the start of Emissary, and the effects are really, really impressive. If it was a sort of a visual effects work rather than it being a CGI model to start with, because it just gets its sort of source section kind of eaten away by the Borg cutting beam. It's pretty nasty, but it is what the only time we see the Wolf 359 battle live. Otherwise we just see the aftermath of it in Best of Both Worlds, and it's kind of weird because it's a series that starts actually a few years before it starts in that sense, because it starts with the flashback, which I intoned about at the start of the video. So this goes, this issue goes into quite a lot of detail about the Saratoga, because obviously it is an important ship in that it's the first ship we actually see in Deep Space Nine, and it's a very it looks quite sort of sleek. It's the Miranda class is weird in that it doesn't have a secondary hull, so its secondary hull is really kind of bolted onto the back of its saucer section. But they're used as the workhorse, one of the Federation's workhorses for a long time. You can see here, this is where it's going up against the Borg cube there, and not making a dent in it basically, but it is trying, bless it. But there's an Ambassador class, as I say, and in fact that could be the Melbourne there. So they're in the mix, also trying to help A, damage the cube, and B, save the Saratoga, because it's apparent that it's going to be on the firing line pretty rapidly. But again, some nice diagrammatic stuff there. And there it's identifying those outriggers as sensor pods rather than anything else. So old school phaser emitters as well. And of course, this is where you see that this is the Saratoga is a rebadging of the Reliance and the Britannia and the Bozeman and everything. So it's reused a lot, that Reliant model. The Miranda class model gets a lot of reuse. So I just want to talk a little bit now, because I have been talking a lot anyway. But let me just I'll run you through a quick list that I printed off from Ex Astris Scientia of I think that's the right name, isn't it? I'll put a link to the site if you're not familiar with it. It's been up on the internet for who knows how long. I remember looking at it in university as a reference point for all things Star Trek-y. So this one little Borg cube here was responsible for taking out the following ships in a reasonable sort of canonical fashion, I think it's fair to say. So we have Challenger class USS Buran, which I've shown you, the Chain class USS Awani, which I've shown you, Constitution USS Enterprise, allegedly, not really, but the remnants are in there. We've got there was an Excelsior study model, which I don't have a model for, which was the the USS Alka-Seltzer, apparently. Funny. Now, actually, you know what? Those, I tell a lie. Perhaps I'm fibbing. I think you can get those models from Eaglemoss, but I don't even know if they appeared on screen as such. That's interesting. There's another Excelsior study model in there, apparently. In fact, another Excelsior model, a 4-nacelled Excelsior study model. So they must have been throwing in absolutely anything they had lying around, basically. So a lot of dead Excelsiors in the graveyard. Freedom class USS Firebrand, which I've shown you. Proto-Nebula USS Melbourne. Oh, so the Melbourne was a... so the Melbourne was the... so perhaps I got that wrong then. So the Melbourne is the Nebula class. Which is... I say, it is name-checked as being killed off, but I could have sworn that there was it was the Excelsior class that appeared in Emissary, but obviously I'm wrong about that. Okay, that's interesting. So that was the one that Riker would have been getting command of had he chosen to take it up, which had the little extra nacelles. We've got the New Orleans Kyushu class, the New Orleans class USS Kyushu, which I've shown you. We've got the Niagara class USS Princeton, which again I've shown you. That was the 3-nacelled ship. Planet of Titan Study Model 1. Curious. Don't have a model of that, and a second version of that apparently as well. We have there's the USS Tolstoy, which apparently is a Rigel class, but no one knows what it looks like. So I guess there's no canonical information on that one. And then we have the Springfield class USS Chekhov. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but yes, the Chekhov that I showed you earlier as one of the marker pen nacelles was a Springfield class. Not presumably related to Discovery in any way, shape or form, but that's what class it was. So this little cube had a busy day. So it ate 38 to 39 Starfleet vessels, plus the Mars Defense Perimeter for whatever that was not worth, and was finally stopped, not by photon torpedoes or phasers, but by Data and Picard, basically. That is what it boiled down to. Now, one of my issues with this episode, conceptually I suppose, is that why would you bother throwing ships like the Oberth class and, you know, even the sort of the Freedom class and so on, you know, why would you throw little tiny ships like that at a Borg cube when you know they're not going to make any difference to it whatsoever? I don't really see the logic, and Starfleet lost a lot of people at Wolf 359 as well as, you know, the aforementioned ships. So why bother? Worse still, Starfleet had families on many of these ships. So basically they just sent these families, including Sisko's family, to the slaughter, knowing full well that the odds were nobody was going to make it out of that situation. Now, had I been the admiral in charge of that fleet, I would have picked an Oberth class ship. I would have transported all the civilians onto it and told it to get out fast. Because you could at least reduce the number of civilian deaths by doing something like that. And as he said in the episode, he had time, because of the Enterprise's engagements with the Cube. Don't even get me started on the number of times the Cube left the Enterprise alone when it could have finished it off easily. Let's not even go there. That's just plot armour, quite frankly. So, you know, they could have reduced the civilian casualties a lot. And that was just a side effect of, you know, this annoying habit that Starfleet had at this point in time of putting civilians on their ships. But one thing I was thinking of when I was thinking about making the video was, why couldn't you have done what I just described, beamed people off a few ships, and then set those ships to ram the Borg cube at warp speed? Now, Riker tells Wesley Crusher to get ready to do that when the Borg are at Earth. And I thought to myself, yeah, why not do that? Now, the counter-argument to that is the Borg have got a decent tractor beam, and yes, they have. So the Borg might have been able to stop a ship dead before it could hit them. Might. But given that you're going faster than light at warp, unless they can actually figure out what you're about to do and stop you before you go to warp, the odds are that you're going to get, you might stand half a chance of getting a run at them. Their ship is mobile, obviously, but it's not super mobile. So I think you'd have a fair chance of actually being able to stop them, personally. So I'm just kind of surprised that no one thought about doing sort of the old sort of suicide run, albeit without anyone actually on board the ship, in order to try and really do them some damage. Because that's personally what I would probably have tried to do, because they already knew from their encounters via the Enterprise that they were not going to stop them with their conventional weapons. There was no chance. But it does say a lot about the survivability of the Borg cube, that you could fire photon torpedoes and phasers, if you were smart, simultaneously from multiple angles, from every sort of vector around the Borg cube, and have them impact and have it not be damaged. Now, I actually wonder why in First Contact they were able to do so much damage. Now, I know they had quantum torpedoes then, which they didn't have at the Wolf 359 encounter, but I still wonder why they were able to do it quite so much damage when in Best of Both Worlds they couldn't touch it. It's really odd. And I get it, I know, it would have made for a very sort of straightforward end, and it would have brought the episode up short if they had been able to stop it at Wolf 359. But the level of devastation caused, I remember being quite shocked when I watched the episode, because you don't expect Starfleet to lose like that. It basically had its head handed to it. It has absolutely no chance, and that battle had repercussions. Well, it had repercussions for Deep Space Nine. It had repercussions left, right, and centre for the Star Trek universe as a whole. So, watching that at the age I was watching it, and indeed having to wait for the cliffhanger to come along as well, I think, as I did, to be resolved, it was one of those things that just sort of drove debate between myself and the few other people in my school who actually watched Star Trek Next Generation quite avidly, and were going, how are they going to get out of it? Because I think the writers themselves realised after they'd done the first episode of the two-parter that actually they made the Borg so formidable that it was really hard to actually pull back from that. So they had to use sort of the data angle to actually try and get themselves out of it, because they'd come up with a species that was so formidable they couldn't actually stop them. That was the irony. But I would be interested to hear if anyone else had any sort of wacky ideas about how they could have stopped them in a technological sense. Because I can't understand why, for example, where was sort of space dock and everything else, and what planetary defences did Earth have other than Starfleet ships? Because it seems weird that the Borg were just sat there in orbit, not getting challenged by anything from the ground or satellites, or But I mean, I know they had limited budgets. They'd already spent a shed load pulling the episode together as it was. So I completely understand why this was an issue for them. But it's just interesting to me that that's the sort of that was the way they went with it. Because I would have just had the Borg being at least a little bit battle damage coming out of Wolf 359. It just seems slightly improbable that despite having Picard leading them, they wouldn't have taken some damage. But anyway, so let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed the sort of the spinny around section and so on. That was just something I thought I'd try. Yeah, I've got a few other Eaglemosses that I've picked up in the course of assembling the fleet for this one. So I might well do a few more Eaglemoss videos in due course, but I am going to sort of remain more focused on the Trek Toys playlist for the time being. But let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this. One other thought I've had, if you've gotten this far, is that I've now got so many Eaglemoss models, I could actually do little sort of recreations on a very basic level, I suppose, of scenes from different episodes where different ships appear. I don't know if that might be a thing. It feels more like an Instagram kind of thing to do. I don't know, but let me know in the comments if you've gotten this far and you think that might be something that you'd be interested in seeing. Because the Eaglemoss models are really, really good, and they are so incredibly varied in terms of the number of episodes and everything else that they've covered, that it is the sort of thing you could potentially do with them. So yeah, just an idle thought on my part there. So I will leave it there. I've got this one out of my system now, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you again, and do like and subscribe. Cheers for now.